those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Leonard. I am the chair of the Department of History here at Middle Tennessee State University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture, also to share some information with you and to thank the people who've made this event possible. The Strickland Visiting Scholar Program, created from the Roscoe L. Strickland Jr. Endowment, brings distinguished scholars with diverse historical backgrounds to MTSU. During their time on campus, these scholars give public lectures and meet with classes and students, and our speaker tonight has met with lots of students and lots of classes. The Strickland lectures provide opportunities for the visiting scholars to present their research to the MTSU community and to the larger public here in Middle Tennessee. The Department of History is very fortunate to be able to bring distinguished scholars to campus, and we are deeply grateful to the Strickland family for their establishment and continuing support of the endowment. The endowment honors the memories of Roscoe L. Strickland Jr. and Lucy Strickland. And so let me tell you a little bit about this remarkable couple. Roscoe L. Strickland Jr. joined the faculty of what was then Middle Tennessee State College in 1949. He was one of the founding members of the college's history department when the department was established in 1963. In 1966, he was elected the first president of the Faculty Senate. Dr. Strickland left MTSU in 1972 to become president of Southern Seminary Junior College, which is now Southern Virginia University. After his death in 1997, his wife, Lucy Strickland, established the Roscoe L. Strickland Jr. Endowment for advancing the study of history. Mrs. Strickland, at one time also a faculty member at MTSU, was the first president of the Murfreesboro League of Women Voters. After the Stricklands moved to Virginia, Mrs. Strickland studied at the Law School of Washington and Lee University, graduating in 1976. When she and Dr. Strickland moved to North Carolina, she opened her own law practice. In 1988, the Stricklands returned to Murfreesboro. Mrs. Strickland continued and finished her law career with Kidwell, South, and Beasley, and served on the MTSU Foundation Board from 1996 to 2002. She passed away in 2008, and the family created a scholarship fund for the music department in her honor. In addition to expressing gratitude to the Strickland family for their generous support, I want to thank the members of the Strickland Scholar Program Committee in the Department of History for their work in planning and executing Dr. Kehoe's visit. Specifically, I want to thank Dr. Alio Lee, Dr. Ashley Riley Sousa, and Dr. Molly Taylor Poleski. I want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Susan Meyer-Shirk, the committee's chair, for all the hours she devoted to planning for this event. Finally, events such as this cannot happen without the work of many administrative personnel and support staff. I want to recognize the people in creative and visual services who designed the posters and advertising for the event, Blueprint Solutions, the Aramark catering staff who catered our reception, production services, and audio-visual services, who I believe are recording tonight's lecture. Finally, I want to thank Tracy Ingram, an executive aide in the history department who handles all of the paperwork involved in making certain that this event happens, and there is quite a bit of paperwork involved. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, a professor in the history department, Dr. Mark Doyle.
I'm not Carly Kehoe. I'm Mark Doyle. I'm a professor of history here at the MTSU History Department, and it is my pleasure to introduce Carly Kehoe this evening. Carly Kehoe is the Canada Research Chair in Atlantic Canada Communities, I get that right, at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She holds a PhD from the University of Glasgow and has held previous positions at Glasgow Caledonian University and the University of the Highlands and the Islands in Scotland. She sits on the editorial boards of the Scottish Historical Review and the Innes Review and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Dr. Kehoe's research focuses on religion, migration, and minority identities in the British Atlantic. Her first book, Creating a Scottish Church, Catholicism, Gender, and Ethnicity in 19th Century Scotland, broke new ground in the study of the assimilation of Catholic migrants in Scotland. Upon its publication in 2010, one reviewer hailed it as, quote, a superb book which develops fresh and nuanced interpretations of a transformative episode in Scottish history. She's just completed a second book on the religious peripheries of the British Empire and their relationship to citizenship and belonging. In addition to her published research, Dr. Kehoe has worked closely in Scotland and Nova Scotia, which means New Scotland. I learned that the other day. To bridge the gap, she's worked closely in both places to bridge the gap between academic research and rural communities. As one of the organizers of the Landscapes and Lifescapes project in Scotland, she worked with numerous scholars and communities to explore the legacies of plantation slavery in the Scottish Highlands. In her current position as Canada Research Chair, Dr. Kehoe is investigating the ways Catholic settlers exploited their colonial identities to enhance their socioeconomic prospects, as well as the relationships that settler communities forged with plantation slavery in the Caribbean. Dr. Kehoe's work challenges a widespread tendency to romanticize and commodify the Scottish Highland and Irish settlers in Atlantic Canada by asking new questions about how they built and sustained their communities. Her work helps to equip communities with a more honest understanding of the legacies of the past in order to develop more robust and sustainable strategies for the future. A powerful advocate for the potential of historical research to tackle some of the world's most pressing problems, Dr. Kehoe urges us all to make our academic work more public, more relevant, and more urgent. These ideas form the basis of her talk tonight, Science, Diplomacy, History Matters, This Is Why. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carly Kehoe.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. And it's lovely to be here in Tennessee. This is my first time to the state, and the impressions are good ones, so good job. But I would like to extend my thanks to the Strickland Visiting Scholar Program for the kind invitation to come down here and visit you and learn about you and your really amazing and interesting public history program. We're trying to do something like that at my university, and so I've taken a lot of notes, actually, and I'm going to be sharing that with my colleagues when I get home. And I would also like to thank the Roscoe L. Strickland Jr. Endowment for enabling this intellectual exchange in the arts and humanities. I think we really need to ensure that there are opportunities like this where scholars can talk to each other across borders. I think that's where we are in the world right now. That's what we need. And to Susan and Mark and Tracy for your help in helping me to get settled and feel so welcome here, and all of the other historians who invited me into their classes, and the students who made me very welcome and asked me lots of questions about immigration to Canada, which I wasn't expecting. Of course, everyone's welcome in Canada. And I learned from one of the students about a maple syrup heist in Quebec that I didn't know about before, so interesting. But it's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you very much. I'd like to start by just offering this overview, this definition of science diplomacy, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. And this is a definition that works for me. There are loads of different definitions. There are ones that are sort of for high-level diplomats, governments, and all that jazz. But then I feel that this one actually speaks to those of us who might be doing more of a soft science diplomacy, not necessarily at the governmental levels, but levels that might actually influence policy. You're all able to read, so I'm not going to read this for you. Just a bit of an overview of how my lecture is going to go this evening. There are really three parts to it, two formal parts and then the concluding section. It's going to seem a little disjointed. It might seem that it's two talks in one, but I assure you that they are connected, and I do bring them together at the end, and there is a thread that runs through them. But the first part is really going to be talking about soft science diplomacy, and it's going to focus on work that I've been doing in Scotland, but also through the Global Young Academy, which is an international organization, to advocate for at-risk scholars. And after this lecture, you're all going to know who they are and why they are important. And then I'm going to link that with my work on migration and thinking about how history is really important to current discussions about migration and migrant integration. And in my own brain, what I've been thinking about a lot because of the work I've been doing with at-risk scholars is how useful is the word refugee, and how do we need to treat it and give it care. And then I'll just end with a few concluding thoughts. In December of 2015, I was in Amsterdam for an interdisciplinary workshop about the refugee crisis in Europe. That year, almost 1 million migrants had entered the EU. 3/4 of them were fleeing war and violence in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. A few major tragedies raised alarm bells about how the plight of refugees and displaced people, and concern about how the host European countries were going to cope with the influx. There was the capsizing of the boat in April and the drowning of over 600 of its passengers in the Mediterranean. There was the abandonment of a refrigerated truck on the Austrian-Hungarian border in August and the suffocation of 71 people. And then there was the publication of that photo in early September. The one, I'm getting shivers right now, the one that sent shockwaves around the world, the lonely body of the 3-year-old Alan Kurdi on a Turkish beach. The events were some of the main markers of what many felt was the beginning of a humanitarian disaster, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the end of the Second World War. And in fact, little Alan, his 5-year-old brother Caleb, and their mother Rayam were just 3 of the almost 4,000 migrants who didn't survive the Mediterranean crossing that year, 2015. When all of this was happening, I was living and working in Scotland. I was a history professor at Glasgow Caledonian University, and I'd been invited to this Amsterdam workshop because I specialize in migration and religion, and was, and still am, a member of the Global Young Academy. The Global Young Academy is a group of early and mid-career research and public engagement leaders from around the world, about 70 countries. We're between the ages of 30 and 45, and we're active in developing connections across academic and national borders. We have a membership of about 200, 500 if you count our alumni, and our core funding, talk about science diplomacy, comes entirely from the German government through the Department of Education. I just don't know the German words for that. At first, I was surprised to have been invited to this workshop. My work concentrates on the late 18th and early to mid-19th centuries, and I wondered what I could actually offer. But within an hour of being there, I understood exactly why I had been invited. This is just a picture of the Global Young Academy at our AGM in Thailand last year. We split our AGMs between developing and developed world countries so that everybody gets access. Looking back, I feel a bit embarrassed admitting this, that I didn't know initially why I'd been invited, but it was a really important lesson for me because it opened my eyes to the necessity of cross-discipline cooperation and collaboration. The purpose of the Amsterdam workshop was to bring together researchers from a range of fields, and we represented psychology, medicine, urban planning, law, politics, entrepreneurship, radicalism, media, gender studies, ethics, and history. Quite a group of people in one room. All of us concentrated in one way or another on aspects of migration, and everyone brought specialist skills and knowledge to the table. It was a fascinating couple of days, but it was also incredibly frustrating. So how did I get interested in science diplomacy? This Amsterdam workshop was the beginning, but not in the way that you might think. It was the start because it had actually made me weary. It made me put my head in my hands. Everyone in the room had good intentions. Everyone felt motivated to do something important. Everybody had big brains and wanted to find a way to use their research expertise to make a difference. And yet, it made me tired because I had seen this before. Time was running short, and we were going to leave Amsterdam with nothing concrete. Everyone had things to say and share, but nothing was being channeled. And I worried that after all of our discussions, after all of our ideas, nothing would come out of it. As I flew back to Glasgow, I think probably to avoid despair, I started to think about what I could do within the world that I knew and understood, and that world is academia. What could I do to change the diagnosis that I had given? And I started to think pretty broadly about my responsibilities as a scholar and as an advocate of research. At the time, I was the co-chair of the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Young Academy of Scotland, a progressive organization very similar to the Global Young Academy that brings together some of the country's most innovative and engaged early and mid-career researchers and practitioners from all sectors. In the Young Academy of Scotland, we're not confined just to academics. We include people far beyond that as well. I thought about the importance of integration and that there had to be academics and practitioners among the refugees and displaced migrants living in Scotland. And I knew that for these colleagues to have any hope of retaining their research careers, that we, those of us in safe academic posts, had to make room for them in our circles. So with the full support of my Young Academy of Scotland colleagues and the Royal Society of Edinburgh's leadership, which was absolutely fantastic, I need to say, through this process, we developed and introduced an at-risk academic and refugee membership scheme in the winter of 2016. And we were the first young academy in the world to do this. And we now have 8 at-risk academic members. I'm an alumna of the Young Academy of Scotland now, but I'm very, very pleased to say that this initiative is still going strong as one of its flagship projects. This is my colleague, Dr. Ala Hamdan. He was an at-risk scholar from Iraq, from Mosul University, and he is a member of the Young Academy of Scotland back in Iraq, and he's introduced the Mosul Book Bridge, which is just trying to get books for the library again, because the university library was completely destroyed. So he was one of our first members. In my own research as a historian, I look at Catholic identity among Irish and Scottish migrants in Scotland, Atlantic Canada, and the Caribbean. And one of the themes that always comes up in relation to the migrant experience is the challenge of integration. It's the most difficult part of the process. And I don't say this in terms of thinking that the movement from one place to another is easy, because I just mentioned the tragedies in the Mediterranean. It is not easy. But integration is often the most difficult part of the process. Sometimes it's actually impossible. And I would like to stress, and a lot of people get this confused, integration is not the same as assimilation. And it's really, really important that we understand the difference. Migrant integration is one of our wicked problems, and I realize this might be a Canadian term, but it's a wicked problem because it has multiple and multi-level causes and no firm solution. We see this over time and space. Race, religion, and language come up again and again and again as inhibitors. So, as I'd mentioned, I'm a historian. And in most ways, I'm a pretty traditional one. I look at how one religious periphery, Catholics, functioned in an empire, Britain, in its imperial program. Perhaps where I'm less traditional, and this will resonate with many of you in the room because of your really outstanding public history programs, is in the emphasis that I place on collaborating with non-academic communities. I believe strongly that academics have an ethical responsibility to contribute to the conversation about our big global challenges, like migration, and to use our research for the public good. Over the course of my career, which is now 19 years, I've learned a lot about the importance of research-led public engagement, to the point where I actually find it really difficult to see research as something that's disconnected from external communities. In many ways, this culture of research has enabled me to be open, when the time came, to the world of science diplomacy. I could see the need for historical insight, and I understood the necessity of working across borders, be they academic, community, regional, or national borders. In 2017, a paper entitled Science Diplomacy, A Pragmatic Perspective from the Inside was published by the National Science Advisors of the UK, New Zealand, Japan, and the United States. And in it, the authors explained that the concept of science diplomacy was given contemporary emphasis at a 2009 meeting in London, England, that was co-sponsored by the Royal Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS. At that meeting, 3 strands of science diplomacy were introduced, or identified, apologies. Science in diplomacy, which is science providing advice to inform and support foreign policy objectives. Diplomacy for science, diplomacy, which is diplomacy facilitating international scientific exploration, and science for diplomacy, scientific cooperation improving international relations. Importantly, these 4 science advisors flagged the limitations of these facets and suggested that such a rigid categorization is impractical in terms of application, and I completely agree with them. It didn't mean anything to me, really. They point out that in reality, it's normal for all 3 to interact when it comes to confronting any issue or challenge. And they highlight climate change as an example, and I would add migration as another. To fit more effectively with the direction of many governments, they proposed 3 new categories: actions designed to directly advance a country's national needs, actions designed to address cross-border interests, and actions primarily designed to meet global needs and challenges. This made more sense to me. As somebody whose work and partnership connects with science diplomacy, these categories were far more flexible and realistic. They are also more inclusive, and they have the potential to inspire wider involvement from the research world. These categories make room for more research expertise. They allow policy to become involved in scientific input and for policy to rely on evidence. Now, all of this is really important, but I'm thinking about this with the brain of an arts and humanities scholar, and I see a major problem, and I'm sure some of you do as well. These top science advisors were really only talking about scientific input from STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And they flag STEM as enabling the enhancement of science literacy and capacity. They and many others have yet to recognize, and it's a failing, they have yet to recognize the necessity of including input from the humanities. I love my colleague, Bill. He has the best posters on his door. It's different to a certain extent, I would suggest, in Europe, where science is taken to mean knowledge acquired by study, as opposed to it simply being an understanding of structure and behavior in the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. This is increasingly the case, I would suggest, in Canada too, where our Minister of Science and Sport, the Right Honourable Dr. Kirsty Duncan, who actually is a scientist, and our Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Mona Niemer, are engaging with a broader understanding of science and what scientific research is, to include people in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. So let me take you back to the Amsterdam workshop, because it's really what happened after that workshop that's important to what I'm talking about here, and it extends far beyond what we did with the Young Academy of Scotland. One of the workshop's organizers, Dr. Eva Alashish, who is a Dutch psychologist based in Australia, she works at the University of Melbourne. She specializes in child trauma. She shared the same fear that I did, that nothing concrete was going to come out of that workshop. And so in addition to writing to all of the senior science societies and the academies, both of us did this, to raise awareness of the issue of at-risk scholars, we teamed up with 2 other Global Young Academy colleagues, Dr. Jan Christoph Heilinger, who is a German ethicist at the University of Munich, and Dr. Liev Orgad, he's an academic, a legal scholar who splits his time between Israel and Italy. And we formed the Global Migration and Human Rights Working Research Cluster. Bringing our thinking together, took time. It took us about a year, actually, given our disciplinary range. But what started to crystallize was this idea of individual responsibility. It was something all of us could see in our work, and it emerged as an anchoring theme for us. We were able to secure funding from Germany's Fritz Thyssen Foundation that allowed us to bring together a larger group of researchers, practitioners, and displaced people to talk about migrant and refugee integration in the past and in the present. And we focused on the Canadian and the European contexts. Our book, which is the output from this conversation, is coming out in the next 3 weeks. And these are my main collaborators, Eva, Jan, and Liev. At the same time that this research cluster was going on, I was also working with 12 other Global Young Academy colleagues from 9 countries to establish the At-Risk Scholar Initiative that builds upon and expands what we did in Scotland. Over the past 2 years, and because our team recognizes the need for constant evolution in our thinking, because this is a constantly changing challenge, integration, we devised a 3-pronged approach to our scheme. Membership, this was the reason we proposed it in the first place. We began this initiative because we wanted to find a way to enable outstanding researchers to get entry or to become members of the Global Young Academy. And when you're displaced, you do not have a university. Sometimes you don't even have a copy of your degree. You have to leave. And so we wanted to make sure that those of us who are outstanding had a way to connect with the bigger research world. We also included mentorship as one of our big, and anybody can do this, right? Any of you can do this. We included mentorship. Because it took time for us to build a membership pilot proposal that would get approved by our Global Young Academy membership, it's not easy getting 200 people to agree on one thing. We introduced a mentorship scheme whereby our partners, specifically Scholar Rescue Fund and Scholars at Risk, would connect us with their early career and mid-career researchers who wanted a mentor in a particular region. Because we are across the world, because we are in so many countries, we could have mentors in the United States or in Canada or in Germany saying, well, I know how the academic world works here. I'm happy to work with an at-risk scholar and make them aware of the research culture here to help with integration. And the third component is the skills development workshop. And this was our response to feedback we were getting from the at-risk scholars. We recognized pretty quickly that our mentees were struggling to adjust to the new academic environment. And because we had no funding, we sought partners to help us deliver these. We have 2 planned for this year, I'm absolutely delighted to say. And next week, after I leave Tennessee, I go straight over to Europe. Our first one is in Italy, and it's a partnership between the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and they're opening one of their labs so that we can host a workshop for at-risk scholars in Europe. The next one will happen in September, and our partner is Wolfson College, Oxford, which is really putting a push on to support at-risk academics at the moment. So I'm delighted. And we're working on trying to find a way to have one in North America, because there are an awful lot of at-risk scholars now in Canada and the United States. But one of the most important things we're doing, I think, is admitting that integration is a long-term challenge and that there is no one fix. Our research backgrounds are helping us to be flexible and responsive and to think about elements that we wouldn't come up with on our own. I'm a historian. There's no way I'm going to come up with all the ideas that we have come up with if it wasn't for a group of really diverse individuals sitting around a table. And it's times like this when I kind of get a little bit frustrated with historians who don't want to look outside of their discipline, because we are in trouble right now in the world, and we have to be cooperative. And it's fun when you talk to people from different disciplines. You learn an awful lot, I must say. And the disciplines represented in our group are history, psychology, philosophy, genetics, linguistics, biomedical engineering, chemistry, cognitive neuroscience, urban health, physics, computing science, and governmental science policy. And this year, our new membership cohort is going to include 3 at-risk academics: a geologist, a chemist, and a sociologist. And what's really important about that is their voices are going to be heard by the policymakers and by the senior science societies with whom we have a very good relationship and interact with all the time. So all of a sudden, their voices are brought to the table. And these are our partners. They have been amazing. And as soon as they heard that we were trying to do this, they were really, really eager and happy to help us and to work with us and to support us with advice, because they've been doing it a lot longer than we have. So I'd like to do a little bit of a switch now to part 2. From a research perspective, this work demonstrates just how complex and varied the migrant experience has been and still is. While my understanding of historical migrations has informed the development of these initiatives, my connections with at-risk colleagues has had a dramatic influence on my thinking about how the historical experience of migrants and refugees, how I'm thinking about that, because it's exposed me to some very real and important discussions about the broader implications of what labeling someone a refugee actually does to them. I think some of you will be familiar with this. This is the definition of a refugee by the UNHCR. Despite the good intentions of the UNHCR's 1951 Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees, designating someone a refugee, and I fully recognize, I completely understand its continued necessity, I would not argue to take it away, to provide protection for people whose lives are at risk. But designating someone a refugee separates individuals and families from mainstream society. What all of the people I've spoken with say, and they are either refugees or people likely to become refugees because of changing circumstances that are out of their control, is that they say that that being assigned refugee status has been damaging to them as individuals. Now, I want to qualify this. The people who I've spoken with are researchers. Most hold PhDs and were in full-time academic roles before their displacement, or they were students, full-time students. For them, possessing, or the prospect of possessing the label refugee, while providing an immediate solution to a desperate situation, has stopped them from getting on with their lives on their own terms. They tell me that they are now the objects of pity. They tell me that this is causing them distress, anxiety, and feelings of depression. This is in addition to the trauma they've experienced through displacement, through violence, and through the threat of violence. Most recognize that their lives are never going to return to normal. But there's a common sense of frustration that they've lost their autonomy in addition to their professional identity. And sometimes I try to think about what it would feel like if someone told me I couldn't be an academic researcher anymore. And in all honesty, I haven't been able to imagine it. I don't know. I probably will never know, because we are so lucky in Canada. I will never know what that feels like. And so I can't identify, but I think I have something to offer. But being labeled a refugee for them, it doesn't permit inclusion. It doesn't help them to integrate. It makes them feel powerless and like they've lost control of their own situations. This is what they have all told me, every single one of the people that I have worked with, all of these at-risk colleagues. And to be honest, before I talked to them, before they shared things with me, as a historian, I hadn't given much thought to how labeling somebody a refugee may have affected their life prospects or their ability to move forward. And so what I think needs our attention now is to understand how the process of integration functioned or didn't function. In an Atlantic Canadian context, which is really what I get paid to do, we can do this by looking at the extent to which a culture of social and economic exclusion influenced individual responsibility and agency among approximately 2,500 former enslaved people of African descent in the second decade of the 19th century who went from the American colonies, or America, up to Canada. Sometimes referred to as refugees, the people I'm particularly interested in are those who escaped their enslavement during and immediately following the War of 1812. This research is unearthing a new dimension of migration and refugee integration, and with it comes new questions about what our responsibility is as researchers, as global or national citizens, but also as humans sharing spaces with other humans, because you strip away all of the titles and all of everything else, and we're just the same wherever we go. I think we forget that, and we shouldn't. Given the media attention and spin, we in the West could be forgiven for thinking that we're in the midst of a migrant crisis. We're not. We are not. In fact, the majority of today's migrations are happening in the global South. This was something I didn't know either until I started all of this work. And currently there are close to 2,500 million migrants worldwide, and the majority of them are actually still within their own within the boundaries of their own countries or close by in neighboring ones. A significant proportion, for example, of the 5.6 million registered persons of concern who fled Syria since 2011 have actually gone to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And Turkey actually, the last figure that I saw, hosts about 64%. And in spite of this exodus, over 6 million people remain within Syria who are classed as internally displaced. Again, all of this was news to me until a few years ago. The crisis that has been engulfing Venezuela since 2014 has led to the flight of more than 2.3 million people to bordering countries. While migrant numbers for countries in the global north might feel high, they are not exceptional when considered within the context of global migration over time as well. Historians, I would suggest, but particularly those of us who deal with or explore European empires, are becoming much more aware of the need to understand, but also to help others understand, our students, our colleagues, our friends, and our relatives, how colonialism has influenced contemporary practices of managing ethnic pluralism. How colonialism, and Eric Bleach, who's an American political science, I quite like what he writes. He suggests that we need to understand the connection between how ethnic diversity was managed in a colonial setting and how it was done in the parent country, because there were an awful lot of connections. In a recent article on the place of refugees in historical research, Peter Gatrell, who's a professor of economic history at the University of Manchester, he makes a case for using an emerging history of displacement across space and time to address the aspirations, actions, and trajectories of refugees. He puts the issue of displacement in the category of history from below, but this raises a few questions for me. What did the term refugee mean in an historical setting? When is it appropriate to apply the term refugee to historical groups and movements? And might applying the term history from below, when it's not about class, when it's not about income, might it do more harm than good when trying to understand an extremely complex experience? In other words, does it force us to put a square peg into a round hole? Philip Marfleet, a sociologist at the University of East London who works on migration and refugee studies, is deeply critical of what he sees as historians' amnesia about the topic of refugees and mass displacements. Located within his criticisms, though, is a recognition of the significance of historical inquiry to extending understandings of the migrant experience and the role that it has played in shaping national narratives. Now, I'm not going to say that I agree with him, and I'll explain why in a minute, but his critique did force me to pause and to reflect. And I must admit that I don't tend to consider the people that I study to have been refugees, even though some of them at certain points could be and were classified as such. I suppose his prompting made me wonder if historians, because of how we approach it and describe it, migration, integration, if we've actually normalized the process of mass movement in our work because we simply see it as part of a bigger story and we're just getting through it. One of my hesitations surrounds how and when the term refugee was used in a historical setting. I worry that if historians start to declare, and I'm seeing this, I worry that if historians start to declare migrant groups refugees, when there is no evidence to suggest that this is how they perceived themselves or were perceived at the time, then we break our number one rule, which is being true to the past by being true to the evidence. Evidence is really important. If I think about the 2,500 formerly enslaved people who migrated north to what eventually became the Canadian Maritimes, mainly Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, the term refugee was applied to them by colonial officials and by themselves on occasion. We see it in the archives, we see it in the sources. And their flight did correspond with one specific disruptive event, with a war. But there were a lot of other things going on as well. Considering when the refugee label was applied, I would suggest allows us to see their agency. That their agency was recognized by the host societies is evidenced by the fear that their arrival and resettlement, which wasn't always permanent, provoked. It's very clear that a lot of people, colonial officials and not, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick didn't want them there. And in fact, in Nova Scotia, tried to entice them to go to Trinidad. And I'm sure you're not going to be surprised that most didn't want to go. In fact, out of the 2,500, I think only 95 agreed to go. I'm not an expert on race or racial theory, but I encounter references to its influence regularly among the groups I study. Race is a major factor in determining citizenship and in enabling integration. In the British context, for example, the one I'm more familiar with, citizenship was determined in the 18th and 19th century, late 18th, 19th century, was determined by whiteness. But we need to understand that there were varying categories of white. The Scottish Highlander and the Irish Catholic, for example, were Celts. And so they were perceived as less white than their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. But they became more white when they were placed alongside, indigenous, free people of color, or enslaved populations. According to Harvey Amani Whitfield, the leading scholar on slavery in the Maritimes, you really should read his stuff. This group of migrants had numerous examples of self-help and self-assertion strategies. Yet we have been limited in our assessment because the majority of the records were created by the white colonial elite. But in other ways, there are other ways to see how they were. There are sources that exist which bear their voices, such as the petitions they made when something wasn't right and they wanted something to change. We have to be more creative with the sources that we engage with which we engage. From these petitions, for example, we know that they referred to themselves as inhabitants of color, people of color, these are all quotes, people of color, and refugees, while those creating the formal colonial records referred to them as Black refugees, which is what they're widely known as in Nova Scotia today, Negro refugees, people of color, and Black people. The petitions show us how they referred to themselves depended on a particular situation. And again, this is really important in terms of understanding agency. Within the confines of colonial structures, formal and informal, they were trying to take charge of their own futures and in fact did take charge of their own futures by actively resisting a lot of pressure to get them to go to Trinidad. They were trying to integrate in ways that worked for them, not in ways that the colonial governor thought was appropriate. What I'm basically saying with all of this is that terminology is really, really important. I tend to use the term migrant as opposed to refugee because in my mind, it seems more suitable for people on the move. And it assigns a degree of power to those who are normally perceived as having had less power than those who remained, often but not always, or to those of the host country. And I also tend to pair migration with the word participation because it recognizes migrants as co-creators of a larger process. Applying this kind of lens prompts us to think in terms of how migrants integrated rather than if they were integrated. We are compelled to begin our inquiries from a different position because of the new questions that this inspires. I'm sorry, I need a drink of water. In the context of the British Empire, framing the experience of migrants and minorities in terms of agency and participation elevates the power of the individual to a level where it can be seen to have mattered. This enables us, I would suggest, to take a closer look at integration and what is needed to make it more effective. This changes our understanding of what, well, in my brain, this changes our understanding of what the British Empire actually was, how it grew, and how it gained more and more authority in the way that it did. When considering migrant and or refugee integration, we do have to be mindful of the imperial backdrop and how this is influencing, consciously and not, their experiences today. Thus, I agree with the point that the integration policies that we see today are continuations of the ones that were developed as part of the process of imperialism, and that to understand post-colonialism, which I still struggle with, to be quite honest, so please don't ask me to define it, we need to build up an awareness of the form and content of colonialism and its subsequent articulations. In a piece, and I'm just going to conclude now with just a few thoughts that I like. In a piece published by The Conversation, two Irish-based scholars who are actually experts on water supplies wrote that fixed mindsets push academics towards publishing instead of making a contribution to business and society. And those of us who do that sometimes suffer, and we shouldn't. They explain that wicked problems, which are like a tangled mess of thread, and when they wrote that, I thought, that's exactly what it is. They require academics to start moving in circles beyond the universities. And I think they're absolutely right. But it's not easy, and it can be really intimidating for those of us who have never done this before and may not know where to start. The work of the historian, me, and many of you has to be open to interdisciplinarity when it comes to confronting global challenges. We need to be part of creating the environment that enables and facilitates innovative and novel thinking. I don't want anybody to ever come to me and say, historians don't have a role to play, or why are you studying history? Like, I don't want to hear that. So I need to be active in showing why that can't be said to me. We need to reach out to our colleagues in the pure and applied sciences or hard sciences, in business and in the social sciences, but also to stakeholders in affected communities, and we need to be the ones proposing collaborations. We need to take the lead in this. And we need to make time to do this. It is urgent, and once we've done this, we need to speak with policymakers and share our insights with them, and this is hard. It's very hard to do, but we need to do that. The EU Summer School program is an excellent example of what I think I would certainly love to see more of in Canada. And this is a picture of it here. The EU runs these summer schools, obviously in the summer, for people in various governments, policymakers, or people who are involved with policy development. And they invite academic researchers to come in and basically give lectures and talks and seminars on a particular topic. So in September, I was invited to go to Austria to talk about migration, and also to talk about academics at risk. And so this is us on a panel, and these are three academic colleagues, at-risk academics, two from Turkey and one from Yemen. And I think this is a brilliant way to get research directly to the people who are writing the policies. I'd like to leave you with a thought from a UK scholar, Mary Hickman, a sociologist working in the field of Irish historical studies. She argues that people's ideas of how it was, meaning specifically a place and a way of life, shapes how they see it as being now. We need to ensure that representations of the past include the new research that takes us beyond the traditional narratives and power dynamics. We need to train our students, and I'm really happy that so many of you came. We need to train our students to understand how their research connects with policy, regional, national, and global policy, and how they might participate in the conversation about the larger and more challenging problems facing our societies today. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for your time.
Thank you very much, Carly. That was wonderful. And we have some time for questions now. We're going to have a mic on that side of the room and one on this. And if you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up there and I'll get this to you.
Can I say one thing to the
Absolutely.
students? I talked about academics at risk from like an employed academics perspective. There are actually a number of groups, of student groups, who are working to advocate for student scholars at risk. Just throwing that out there, in case you have time on your hands.
This might seem like a really mundane question. How do you get connected with Scholars at Risk? I mean, how do you find each other?
So, oh, you mean not the organization, but actual scholars at
Actual
risk?
scholars. How do you even know in any given migrant community that some of them are scholars who...
That was a big fear for us when we launched the program in Scotland, because we thought, okay, we have this in place and we're ready to go. And there was an application process, but we thought, is anybody going to apply? And so what we did was we actually worked through the Scottish Refugee Council, and then also some professors at the University of Glasgow were really helpful to us, one is the UNESCO chair in, I'm going to get this wrong, something to do with migration and integration. And so she had networks that kind of spread out. And we just put it on social media. And we actually got 8 applications. And then once you start once people start to hear about what you're doing, and because we also had the backing of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, they were brilliant for helping us get the word out. And once you get known for doing this, word spreads, and people start to find out. And then with the Global Young Academy, we're spoiled with the networks that we have. So we reached out to Scholar Rescue Fund and Scholars at Risk and Care and all those partners, and they said, absolutely, we have people who would want to work with you. So we were lucky with the 2 kinds of organizations that I was certainly aligned with. But I get emails probably sometimes 2, maybe 3 a week from at-risk scholars around the world who ask for help, because all of a sudden when they search this, my name comes up, or the Global Young Academy comes up, or Edinburgh, the Young Academy of Scotland comes up. So it's more kind of pounding the pavement a little bit and finding out, like, is there a legal aid? I don't know if it's legal aid in the United States. That's what we would call it in Canada. Like a legal aid organization that works with people who are either trying to get into the country or trying to find a way to stay because they're at risk. And so if you just speak to some of the people involved in those organizations, they'll know people. And a lot of at-risk academics don't identify. They won't say what they are. And it could be because they're worried about, sort of putting their head above the parapet a little bit. But once they feel a little bit more comfortable, some of them will start to identify. Yeah.
You talked about the group that's looking for books for the library. Do you know what kind of books they're looking for the university?
They're looking for any kind of books that you'll give them. It's the Mosul Book Bridge.
Okay.
The library was completely destroyed. And so Ala started it in partnership with the Young Academy of Scotland, and now there are a lot of other people involved. And he was actually interviewed by the BBC because there's becoming awareness of this. So any kind of books, because they have nothing. Yeah.
You talked about the benefit of interdisciplinary connections. Do you see a lot of benefit also from intercultural perspectives? Like, I imagine you do, but can you touch on that too? Because I imagine it's a very important aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having spent, because I was in Scotland for 16 years, so that's a long time. And it's funny because, you know, being a Canadian, I can't speak for Americans, but being a Canadian, you think you come from the best country in the world and you know everything. And then you go abroad and you're like, oh no, I don't know very much. So it kind of corrects you, actually, by being involved with people from different countries and all over the world. But what I found really, really useful about it is the different perspectives that you start to learn about, and how one thing that you thought was right and okay, actually you see a very different side of it on the other side of the world. And you learn about people's challenges, you learn about successes, you learn about good news that doesn't usually get spread around. So initiatives that are going on, there's this really amazing initiative on the African continent, the African Science Leadership Program, which is about trying to encourage the development of science in the countries there. I wouldn't know anything about those initiatives if it wasn't for these international collaborations. I think it's been transformative for my thinking, not just in this advocacy stuff, but how I actually think as a historian. It kind of took me out of my little silo. I thought that was healthy.
Any questions? All right.
You talked a little bit about the term refugee. So as best as I know, the League of Nations defines that term and attaches legal protections to it and begins to work with displaced people. Mm-hmm. But you spoke specifically about ways in which that term now can be harmful.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that and maybe provide some illustrations?
So I'll say two things. It can be harmful. I see projects, historical projects, sort of saying there about refugees because it's kind of a buzzword at the moment, and I don't want to be insensitive for using that term buzzword. But academics, when they're chasing funding, it's tough, and they will engage, they will latch onto something, and they will say, well, I'm actually working on refugees, without necessarily taking the time to think about what are the qualities of this? Does it actually count? And is it more about me trying to get, 500,000 pounds, or is it more about me trying to really think about this past movement? So that's one of the problems. But then today, and that was one of the reasons why I said I'm only talking to the researchers. So I am only talking with a group of people who are privileged. They're not privileged really in our societies, but they were privileged in their own countries. Some people really appreciate the label refugee because it allows them to come to Canada, for example, and get out of a war zone and make sure their children are safe. But for somebody who was just like me, everybody was really, really upset with that label, and I didn't know that. I did not know that at all, and it was probably the biggest kind of moment. I don't know what the word is. You guys will know that word. Yeah, that. Where I just stopped and I thought, oh my goodness, how do I start to think about this in a different way? Because the benevolent Canadian, right? It's like, I'm going to help. It's like, well, the benevolent Canadian needs to learn how to talk first, or rethink the words that she was using. And so it was really, really instructive to hear that. And I have she's my friend actually, and she's an at-risk scholar, and she's like, Carly, because she came from quite a privileged background in Syria, and she's like, it's very, very hard for me to be in a situation where people are doing things for me and trying to give me things, and they're treating me like I can't do anything, and they're looking at me with pity. And she said, I used to be the one who would provide food, and I used to be the one who would provide clothing, and she would be the one that would be organizing all of these activities to support people that needed something else. And so for her, she actually had to stop interacting with people who looked at her in a way like she wasn't capable of taking care of herself. And so when you have a really gentle and honest conversation with a friend, it kind of makes it very obvious why it doesn't work for everyone. So from the historical perspective, we need to just be careful how we use the term. And sometimes it can be applied. And the research that is going on in Nova Scotia with and I'm saying Black refugees because that's how they're often written about, but this scholar, Harvey Amani Whitfield, and he's at the University of Vermont, he's the one who started saying they don't talk about themselves like that all the time. And if we're looking for history, we have to be true to the sources, and they don't see themselves like this all the time. So how do they see themselves? Because that's how we should be writing about these historical figures. So that's, I guess, a little bit more about what I was thinking when I wrote that.
One more question. All right, if you would hand that over to.
Hi, I was wondering how would we help at-risk students?
What I would recommend is that you Google the group of students at Trent University in Ontario, and you get in touch with them and you ask them how they started it. But also, if you look on the Scholars at Risk webpage, there will probably be instructions for students helping students. But Trent has started it, and they actually managed to get, I think they managed to get some money from their student union to have this organization. And in Canada, your university could become a member of Scholars at Risk, just so you know. Mine did. And so when we had a meeting of all the Canadian members, this group of students was there representing their university alongside like professors. So it was fantastic because you're hearing the student perspective. And it's a lot easier to do than you think. So yeah, I thought all of these things were going to be really hard, but you're kind of pushing against an open door.
Thank you very much, Carly. That was great.